Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be covering Game 2 of the 2014 World Chess Championships. Game 1, we had a draw between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand. In Game 2, we had Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces and Vishy Anand playing the black pieces. So we'll go ahead and get started. Magnus Carlsen started with pawn to e4, so pretty excited to see that. More of an aggressive opening than, let's say, pawn here to d4, which is usually what we see at the high-level play. Vishy Anand responds with pawn to e5. Knight f3, knight c6, and so we get into the Rai Lopez after bishop here to b5, and a few different ways that Vishy Anand could approach this. He could play pawn here to a6, he could play pawn here to d6, he could play knight to f6, a lot of different options. He chose for the Berlin defense, and that is the knight to f6. Sometimes can be somewhat drawish, definitely a solid defense from black. What interesting is Magnus Carlsen actually plays the Berlin defense with quite frequency, and he knows this defense inside and out. So interesting to see Vishy Anand playing against someone who knows this better than maybe anyone out there. So interesting to see how this will continue. We first see pawn here to d3, solidifying this pawn chain right here. Sometimes it's pretty common to just see castle on the king side right here. Even if the knight takes here, you're going to see the rook swing over here to e1. Usually not going to see that. But instead we do just instead see pawn here to d3, bishop to c5, castle on the king side, and then pawn here to d6, getting ready to castle on the king side as well. We now see rook to e1. Very interesting. Magnus Carlsen, when he was playing against the Berlin defense just in the candidates tournaments last year, he played pawn here to c3. So I guess he and his colleagues or the team that he's kind of prepared this for usually have an inner circle of really top players that you prepare for specific openings. May have looked at this and said, okay, rook to e1 maybe gives us a better chance than the pawn to c3, which Magnus Carlsen has kind of been playing for a while. So castle on the king side for black, and then white takes here on c6. It is also interesting because usually white waits for pawn here to a6 first. So he could try a different thing, knight to c3, and then after pawn to a6, we now see the exchange. Knowing that this is maybe a little bit better pawn structure for white going into the endgame, but instead just decides to go ahead and take with his bishop here on c6. So after the exchange, then pawn here to h3, controlling the square here on g4. So this light square bishop can't come out to g4, and this knight can't come here to g4 as well. Black's now going to centralize his rook here on e8, and then knight to d2. And what's interesting is knight to d2 is not a move that you typically see in this variation. This is a pretty common variation. Knight to c3 is a lot more common. And so you have players like Magnus Carlsen that are getting so deep into these openings. They're finding these small improvements or nuances to different openings that haven't really been seen at high-level play. And so this is again, maybe a player that's going to transform a lot of the metagame almost for some of these openings. Knight to d2, very interesting move right here. It allows him to come to b3 if he wants to attack this bishop. Also to come to c4, maybe more of a centralized outpost here that he can now attack a5. So a lot of different options with this knight, but it does also mean that this bishop here on c1 is going to be hanging out for a little while, not going to be getting involved too much into the game. Now this knight comes back here to d7. Also something that you don't really see from black. If you kind of look at it, it makes more sense to get this bishop involved. So bishop to e6. It seems very logical to me as I look at it, centralizing your bishop, developing more of your pieces. This is really controlling the center of the board. Rook over here to b8, controlling this semi-open file is always good for your rooks. This pawn right here on a7 is under no pressure at all, so this seems like a pretty good move. So knight to d7, again, two knight moves here that they're trying to set up for more of a central location for their knights, but moves that you typically just don't see. So we now see knight to c4, getting ready to maybe go knight to a5, and then attack this pawn here on c6. Vishy Anand decides to go ahead and bring his bishop back here to b6, controlling the square here on a5, opening up the opportunity if Magnus Carlsen wants to go ahead and exchange right here. Vishy Anand no longer has his double pawns here on the c file, so this is one option on board. Magnus Carlsen doesn't want to do that right away, instead plays pawn here to a4, starting to add more pressure on the queen side. Just responded with a pawn here to a5 from Vishy Anand, and then we now see the exchange. So maybe Magnus Carlsen likes this setup a little bit better than the pawn back here on a7. But either way, Magnus Carlsen now decides to go and push forward with pawn here to d4, trying to break up the center control that black has with his pawn here on e5. So queen here to c7, and then rook to a3. Again, one of those moves that you really have to be an aggressive player to play. Just as I kind of look at the board, it's not very common to play rook here to a3, looking to swing this rook over here, especially against a grandmaster. Maybe lower level play, you want to get just all your major pieces on one side of the board and attack your opponent because you know you're going to make a mistake. But usually, queen to d3, continuing with your development, getting major pieces involved into the game. Maybe not a great square for this dark square bishop, although he does want to get this involved into the game. G5 just kind of hanging out there. Can't really come to f4 right now, but maybe after the exchange of the pawns he can. Bishop to d2 doesn't seem too bad. Maybe then he brings his queen to e2 and try to have some sort of play on the light squares, or maybe control this e file if he wants to. But rook to a3 was not something that I was expecting, but definitely excited for him to play it so that he can really start a strong attack on the king side. We now see the knight come back here to f8. So the knight's kind of moving all over the place. Maybe this is opening up the door to play knight to e6, maybe knight to g6 later on into the game. But usually just moving your knight all over the board seems a little bit passive. It's just kind of responding to what Magnus Carlsen is doing right now. After the pawn takes it right here, then we're going to see the knight come over here to h4, opening up the door for this queen here on the light squares to go ahead and get involved on the king side. Rook over here to d8, controlling this open file. Now the queen's going to come here to h5, so pretty aggressive move. We now see pawn here to f6, controlling this pawn that white's attacking with his queen right here. Knight to f5, nice little outpost move for white. And then we see bishop here to e6, centralizing developing piece for Vishy Anand. Now a few people have looked at this and said, this bishop here to e6, probably not the best. Nakamura actually tweeted earlier today that he thought knight to e6 is really where this knight belonged, especially in kind of the exchange variation of the Rai Lopez. Again, these players think about the game in a whole different way. Bishop to e6 seems reasonable. I think it's completely okay to play this. You definitely want to get your light square bishop involved into the game. Even knight to G6 seems fine to me. That's not kind of a move that has kind of been talked about. It's played later in this game, but I think even in this position right here, knight to G6 is completely fine. It kind of stops a lot of the threats that white has. Maybe later Vishy Anand wants to get his light square bishop involved, but decides to go ahead and start with bishop here to E6, and then the rook's going to swing over here to G3 as we talked about. That's kind of why he wanted to bring it up here, get as much forces as he can, starting to attack his opponent on the king side. Now knight to G6, and now pawn here to H4. So Magnus Carlsen again throwing everything at his opponent. If you kind of look at it, Vishy Anand is just kind of trying to play defense. He's completely not doing anything as far as proactive. Magnus Carlsen has all the attacking pieces right now. So it's just a matter of, can Vishy Anand hold on, maybe try to find some counterplay later into the game, maybe on the queen side. Maybe he can control this D file right here long enough to maybe get some counterplay. But right now, he's definitely just playing defense. Now the bishop takes, we do see an exchange. Now the pawn's going to come to f5, forcing the knight to move. Now the knight's going to be attacking this queen, so we're just going to see an exchange right here. Again, that dark square wasn't doing too much, so the fact that he can just go ahead and exchange with that piece right there on f4, that's going to be completely fine. Now this rook's going to swing over here to c3 and start to just attack more material on board. So he's attacking this pawn here on c6. This queen is defending that. Now we're going to see the pawn push up here to to c5, so it does have a little bit more protection from this pawn here on b6. Then this rook's going to swing up to e6. Now it's attacking both this pawn here on b6. Also, this pawn here on f6, we see the rook swing over here to b8. Again, all these pieces, as we look at it, are really just offensive. Magnus Carlsen, just a little bit better position. Now, all of a sudden, his rook is attacking not only this pawn here on c5, but also the pawn here on f4. Black, all of a sudden, he sees this queen, his most powerful piece that's defending this pawn, also defending this pawn right here. So, any misstep, and all of a sudden his entire structure is going to be lost. We do see the queen come here to d7, getting ready to try to have some last-ditch effort to kind of come down here and attack his opponent. Magnus Carlsen does have it defended with his queen here on h5, so we just see the king to h2 doesn't want to have to worry about things too much. Rook over here to f8. Now this rook's going to swing over here to e4, trying to double up on this e file right here. Rook to b7 wants to make sure that black controls this 7th rank right here. It's always important, especially if you have rooks and queens on board, that you don't let your opponent control the 7th rank. If they do, bad things happen. Now the queen's going to come back here to e2, tripling up here on the e file. Pawn here to b5, not doing too much, trying to counterplay on the queen side a little bit, but there's not going to be too much going on. This pawn's protected by the rook here on e4, so it's not real clear how Vishy Anand's going to continue, but for the most part, he needs to make sure that he's defended against these rooks and queen here on the e file. Anand responds with rook here to b4, attacking this pawn. This rook's going to swing up here to e7, attacking the queen. The queen has to move. He can't take this pawn right here, although it may look like it after the rook takes right here. White's up in material. Black can't actually recapture. If he does try to recapture, then the queen can just come here to c4, and there's no real way to stop White's attack. You know, if you try something like king here to h8, queen here to f7, can't really stop the attack here. This rook's going to fall. If we try something like that, it's going to be checkmate. So not many great options right now. So Vishy Anand doesn't even want to try to deal with that pawn because it is somewhat of a trap right there, although Magnus Carlsen, more than anything, is just trying to put pressure on his opponent. He knows that his opponent's not going to take that pawn right there. So queen to d6, queen here to f3, not only kind of stopping this pawn pushing forward with a discovered attack, but also adding a defender here, and then also opening up kind of a back door to controlling this b7 square, which could potentially, if Vishy Anand makes a mistake, open up the door for Magnus Carlsen to control that 7th rank. So now we do see an exchange. The queen's going to come here to e4, and then pawn to f3, a discovered check. So the pawn's kind of forced to move here to g3, no other real option. And then in the game we see pawn here to h5, and this is kind of the mistake in the game. Magnus Carlsen now plays queen here to b7. Magnus Carlsen now controls this important 7th rank. There's no way to really stop this right here, and Vishy Anand's actually forced to resign in this spot. Now, he could have come back if we kind of look at it and say, instead of pawn to h5, you know, obviously that's going to be bad. He could try queen to d2, and then we see queen taking here on f3, queen taking here on c2. So if we count up material, you know, white has 5 pawns, black has 5 pawns. There's no clear way right now for white to go ahead and win this, but in the game, unfortunately, he did not do that. We see pawn here to h5, queen come up here to b7. White completely controls this, and there's no way for really to stop this. If the king comes to h8, again, you know, the rook takes here on g7, it's going to be mate very quickly. You know, black could, if he wanted to, just go ahead and sacrifice his queen. He could play, you know, queen takes here on e7, and then the queen captures here on e7. Yes, it's not going to be checkmate right away, but you know, Magnus Carlsen has a huge lead in material. This queen can just pretty much gobble up all these pawns on board. So in this position, Vishy Anand looked at it, recognized he had made a huge blunder, given up that very, very powerful 7th rank right here, and was forced to resign. So Magnus Carlsen, after 2 games, is up an entire point, so it's going to be very, very difficult for Vishy Anand. He does have 10 more games left in this series, so all is not lost, but Magnus Carlsen usually only gets better over time. He just kind of has that ability to kind of wear down his opponent, so definitely not good for Vishy Anand. They both have a rest day tomorrow, and then they'll be back the following day, so Vishy Anand will have the white pieces. Hopefully you can get back on track, make this thing pretty interesting. But very, very solid game for Magnus Carlsen. Put a lot of pressure on his opponent, especially in the middle game. Didn't give Vishy Anand any opportunity for counterplay. And then just over time, more and more pressure, and eventually Vishy Anand cracked, made a mistake, and Magnus Carlsen won. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video commentary on the World Chess Championships. Excited to see all these games played. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.